My person was Samson Occom, 1723 to 1792. In his early life, Samson Occom was a Mohegan tribal leader, an ordained Presbyterian minister, which was a major fundraiser for what is now Dartmouth College. He was also the leader of an intertribal revitalization and resettlement movement and the first published Native American author. As a teenager, Occom taught himself to read and write in order to better understand biblical texts, which was popularized during the Great Awakening. During his adult life, Occom became an outspoken advocate for Indian rights. In 1772, he achieved celebrity by delivering a sermon at the execution of Moses Paul, an Indian who was convicted of murder, a landmark in American sermonic literature and a pointed criticism of Anglo spirituality hypocrisy. It went through 19 editions and was reprinted in several languages. As a result of this, Occom received many invitations to preach, and on the strength of connections made in his travels up and down the eastern coast, he became convinced that eastern Indian tribes had to withdraw from the corrupting influence of European settlers. Some of his famous works: A Choice Collection of Hymns and Spiritual Songs, 1774. A Sermon Preached at the Execution of Moses Paul, 1772. A Short Narrative of My Life, 1768. Journals, 1754 and 1786. Hero in Roots, and the collective writing of Samson Occom, which was edited by Mohegan. Moving on to his death and to one of his greatest contributions, Brothertown. Throughout his ministry, Occom served as a leader among the Mohegans. He would handle land disputes between the tribe and the Connecticut colony. After the American Revolution, he led a coalition of 7 Indian tribes to form a new community called Brothertown for Indian Christians in upstate New York. In 1792, Occom founded a Presbyterian church in Brothertown, but died shortly after. The War of 1812 caused the Iroquois to move to Wisconsin due to the fear of allying with the British. Brothertown Indian Nation still exists today, although it is entangled in a long-running legal battle for recognition from the federal government. Here is a timeline of Samson Occom's life. In 1743, he began to study theology at the Latin School of Congregational Minister Eliza Wheelock, and he stayed for 4 years until leaving to begin his own career. In 1759, he was officially ordained a minister on August 30th, 1759, by the Presbytery of Suffolk. In 1761, Occom traveled to the Six Nations of the Iroquois in upstate New York to preach. In 1768, Occom sailed from Boston on December 23, 1765, and didn't return until May 20th, 1768. In 1774, Occom published a sermon of the execution of Moses Paul and a choice collection of hymns and spiritual songs. In 1792, Occom died on July 14th in New Stockbridge.
And who is Olad Equiano? Olad Equiano was an African American born in 1745 in Isaka, in Nigeria. He was an African slave kidnapped from his village at the age of 11. He was the first American-born former slave to write his autobiography without white writers' help. Equiano became famous for being one of his earlier works written in English by a former slave. Equiano's slavery story. During the 16th and 17th centuries, Benin, an empire with its headquarters in Nigeria, imported and exported slaves, both male and female, either purchased by Europeans elsewhere in West Africa or kidnapped from other neighboring villages. At this time, Olad was kidnapped at the age of 11 and sold in one of the African countries, where he was then sold to a British naval officer, Captain Pascal, who took him to London. Equiano became a personal servant to a lieutenant in the English Navy who renamed him Gustav Vasa. After 6 years, Equiano was sold to a West Indian trader who soon sold him to a Philadelphia Quaker and trader Robert King. Equiano's famous work was his autobiography. Ola Equiano writes an autobiography, a writer who had a life full of adventures and difficulties. Equiano experienced many different types of slavery, and he writes all about it. Also, he writes about religion and customs from distant lands. everything in his autobiography.
Native American Writing Museum display. Native American literature is the traditional oral and written literatures of the indigenous people of Americas. Oral and written literatures examples are petroglyph, myth, folk tales, pictographs. Altogether, these are oral tradition. Oral tradition is ideas, cultural activities, or stories that is passed on from one generation through either songs, folk tales, and myths. Native American symbols such as rain, moon, three nights, boy, girl are used to communicate. The myth is a traditional story. It explains how things in the world works, usually using supernatural elements. Oral tradition, as I said before, is an example. Myth falls under oral traditions. Folktale is a popular story that was passed on in a spoken form from one generation to the next. A pictograph is a drawing or painting that is created on a rock, used to communicate. This is an example of a petrograph. You can also consider it as a petroglyph because it's also carved. The image is also carved into a rock, which is used to tell a story, which is also a petroglyph. The Native Americans had a complex religious beliefs, advanced political systems, social values that all reflected in their writings. Some recent authors of the Native American is Scott Momaday, Native American writer Sherman Joseph Alexie, female Native American writer Eden Robinson, and another one is James Welsh. This is a book from Eden Robinson. She's a female Native American writer. In 1995, she published her first work, Traplines. But however, Monkey Beach was what she was best known for. Here is House of Dawn, which is Scott Momaday. He's a Native American Renaissance author. In 1968, he published his best-known novel, House Made of Dawn. He uses his platform to grant many other Native American voices opportunities to showcase their work. For James Welsh, his book is, he's a Native American Renaissance author. In 1986, he published his best-known novel, Falls of Crow, right here. Through his poetry work, he uses vivid imagery which tends to attract his audience. The Native American is demonstrated through children's novels, chapter books, picture books, and poetry collections. It demonstrates Native American content and characters through settings, character development, language, and illustrations. As I said before, character development. There are 7 tribes of Native American. They fought among each other, but they did not seek to expand other countries. The 7 tribes include the Inuit from Arctic or Sus-Arctic, Mohave from California, Washoe from the Great Basin, Comanche from Great Plains, and Iroquois from Northeast, Cherokee or the Seminole from Southeast, Navajo from Apis and Pueblo from Southwest, And all these tribes, they all fought against each other, but they did not seek to expand from other countries. The Native American literature had like a cultural diversity. At the time of Columbus, who played a part in Native American literature, there was 350 distinct languages existed in the North America, where you see here you have the Iroquois over here on this map that represent the American Indian tribes. Thousands of distinct cultural groups existed as well. Also, the characteristics of the Native American literature is they have like great the oral history. They had good speakers. It valued in many tribes because of the tradition of participatory democracy, stories handed down through oral traditions, and also the Native American didn't have a language. They didn't have a specific language, so they communicated through the pictograph, the petroglyph, and so on. Throughout the Native American writing, they use animals, earth's surface, rivers, rocks, and all things believed to be significant in the life of the Americans' first people, which was the Native Americans. So the first Native American literature texts were offered orally, and which they linked it to the earthly stuff, such as the animals. But one specific animal that they used throughout their books, that the authors used throughout their books, was the coyote, as shown right here. And this is how they carved out the rocks, and they used like earthly stuff to represent throughout their literature. Thank you for coming to my Native American writing museum display, and I hope you guys learned something today from this presentation. This is just a close-up look of everything.